Okay, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Again, thanks so much for coming. Welcome. This is a great turnout. Looks like we've got folks from local government, nonprofit, and the private sector from all across Virginia. So thanks for being here. I'm Kate Wofford. I'm Director of Alliance for the Shenandoah Valley. We're a nonprofit based in Newmarket, working to protect farms and forests, clean streams and rivers, and thriving communities. Our organization is very active in local land use planning in our 6-county service area. So you can imagine that utility scale solar siting has been a big issue for us since probably back in 2018. At the Alliance, we envision solar development that enhances, not diminishes, our extraordinary natural resources and our strong agricultural economy. Most of the Valley counties now have developed solar ordinances. But as you all probably know, this is a quickly evolving industry, and there's a need for information on new and emerging issues. That's why we're here. We're very pleased to be hosting this webinar with some great partners from both sides of the Blue Ridge: the Northern Shenandoah Valley Regional Commission, Brandon Davis; Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission, Bonnie Redesell; and the Rappahannock Rapidan Regional Commission, Patrick Monty. Also, our partners at Piedmont Environmental Council and Stanton-based land use planner Sarah Holberg helped pull this together. I need to say that funding for this webinar has been provided by the Virginia Environmental Endowment. Big thanks to VEE. And a big thanks to the top-notch speakers who are with us today. We are going to drop the agenda in the chat so you can link and follow on the webpage there, and also on that same link are the bios of our speakers. So we won't take time reading out the bios of the speakers, but please click on that link and catch up on our terrific speakers. There's going to be time for questions after each section on the agenda. So if you will, please put your questions in the Q&A as we're going along, and hopefully we'll have time to cover most of those. So with that, I am going to hand things over to Eldon James. Most of you probably know Eldon. He runs the public policy and planning firm, Eldon James Associates in Richmond, and he is going to moderate the webinar for us.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Appreciate it, and appreciate the opportunity to participate. And there's some resources that are available to everyone. You can get them through links on the landing page for this event. And they come from 3 organizations: the Rappahannock River Basin Commission, of course, the Alliance, and from Piedmont Environmental Council. Rappahannock River Basin Commission, of which I serve as contract staff, back in December of 2021, the commission tasked its technical committee with looking at issues surrounding the significant increase in solar energy project development that was going on across the basin. The technical committee took an approach over the course of a year of inviting every stakeholder they could identify in to offer their perspectives. Now, this included the localities, the PDCs, the agricultural community, key state agencies, all the key conservation organizations operating in the area, some technical presentation from Virginia Tech on the impacts on soils and compaction, property rights advocates, primarily through Energy Right Virginia, commissioners of revenue weighed in on the local tax implications, as well as solar developers, Dominion Energy, and the electric cooperatives. And you can find the link to that report. It actually takes you to the River Basin Commission's website and its past meetings page. One of the quirks about that report is you'll find it's labeled as a draft. And that's because after the commission heard the report from the technical committee, it said, let's maintain this as a draft because it's changing. As a matter of fact, from the time it was written to the time it was presented to the commission, new issues had emerged. Also, you'll find the Alliance's recently updated report, Utility Scale Solar Ordinance and Policy Recommendations. And this offers some comprehensive outline of what localities should be considering, along with some resources by topic and examples from across the Commonwealth. And finally, some extensive information from the PEC, a variety of maps, publications, videos on presentations that the staff has given on energy demand, and also one of the big drivers, data centers. Also, you'll find a link to a presentation that PEC staff gave as part of the American Planning Association Virginia chapter's webinar series on the topic, and it gets into much greater detail than we'll even be able to do here today. With that, Kate, if we're ready, I'm going to hand it off to our friends with the Berkley Group, Michael and Luke. And Michael, I think you're kicking this off.
Yes, thank you, Eldon. Let me share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see this, my presentation okay. We will be, and Luke Peters and myself, will be running through a brief presentation talking about best approaches to policy development for utility scale solar. We'll highlight the importance of setting policies in the context of setting regulations, but also the importance to the permitting process as well as to the process to develop siting agreements. So a little bit about us quickly. We're a 13-year-old company, approximately. Local government consulting entirely. We only work with the public sector. We've been involved in solar for approximately the last 7 years. Worked with APA as well as APA and ICMA to develop some resources, PAS memo, but also the solar at scale effort from APA and ICMA. We work in Virginia as well as Colorado on solar, and have also assisted in North Carolina and Kansas. And principally, we work with communities to develop policies as well as regulations for solar, as well as assisting with third-party review of utility scale projects. So I'll let Luke go over the importance of comp plan policies. Luke, just let me know when you need me to advance.
Yep, thank you, Michael. So this webinar is called Beyond Solar Ordinances, but we need to give the rationale for all of the policy land use decisions behind solar. You know, generally speaking, it's important to set a policy in a local land use plan. And of course, this might go without saying, but this is presuming that it's a land use that the community even wants or anticipates being located in your jurisdiction at all. Utility scale solar is a unique land use with specific impacts that vary by geography, by locality. And you want these developed policies to inform the development of your ordinances and your standards and your permit applications, both through the 2232 reviews and through the development and negotiation of a siting agreement. You know, you want that rationale for both of those. And while we're talking about utility scale solar here, you know, we also encourage localities to think about the rationales for accessory solar, small solar, and other renewable energies. Go ahead, Michael. So, yeah, these are some of the policy topics that you would also address in the regulations. And, you know, some of these are more subjective and some are more objective, but you would kind of use these to support the policy and rationale that would then lead to the objective regulations and standards that everyone has to submit to. And we're talking about the, you know, appropriateness in the first place of having solar land use for certain zones, for certain areas, the location, the size, the impacts to your historical and cultural resources, how they're going to impact other sectors like agriculture, especially, as well as potential benefits as well to other other uses and infrastructure, other services. So again, assuming that this is a use that the community wants at all, you are going to want to define the use. First of all, what zones it can go in, what the maximum size of the facility can be, when it gets defined as utility scale, the maximum project area. You know, we've seen limits to 1,000 acres or so. We've seen no limits. We've seen people who only want big facilities. The location, whether you want to locate it a certain number of miles away from towns or designated growth areas, or a certain proximity to transmission lines so that you then don't have the gen tie lines running through from the solar facility through agricultural land to the high voltage transmission lines that they'll connect to. And you can also set a certain density so that you, in a given county-wide or in a given area, so that you don't have so many solar facilities right next to each other, making a de facto larger solar facility. And so here are some of the most important impacts that you'll want to consider in your policy. You know, the impact to roadways and traffic safety, especially during construction, the impacts to the environment through wildlife mobility, taking out large chunks of habitat, the sheer terraforming that has to happen, especially in the Shenandoah. You know, you've got steeper slopes there. Panels can be installed so that they go on a sort of waving landscape, but generally they prefer flatter land. Impact of the soil, erosion, compaction, water quality, which is downstream, no pun intended, of all of those. And of course, the removal of high quality forests and agricultural areas. And then we've got the use and visual impacts. These are generally really important to a lot of rural communities. You know, you're looking at a bucolic scene and suddenly it's just a sea of solar panels. And then as mentioned, the agricultural impacts, soil compaction has been a big topic as of late, and we're learning more and more about that through research being done through Virginia Tech and others. You know, what you want to do with your topsoil, store it, have a balance of materials moved and stored. You know, just the very fact that solar facilities are going to be active for 40 years or more, and you don't know what an area or the uses 40 years down the road are going to look like. And the aforementioned changes to topography that'll have a big impact on stormwater and water infiltration. Stormwater management, again, is also one of the biggest growing issues now that we've seen the installation of some large utility scale facilities and their associated impacts. You know, generally there are BMPs, stormwater BMPs designed and installed to mitigate some of this, but you know, there are different site conditions and different slopes, different soils that contribute to you know, having more water on site than you'd planned for and seeing downstream effects on neighbors' properties and on nearby streams and wetlands. And some of the ways you can address this in your policy and regulations is to think about the size of those basins. Larger buffers that retain existing vegetation, bigger setbacks from wetlands than what is required by law, and requiring that during construction, you stabilize a certain amount of land before you go disturb more land. And then of course, planting native plants that can have deeper tap roots can help with all of that too. And then of course, really important to the policy is what you're going to do at the end of those 40 years, what the land is going to look like, if and when it's going to be returned to its previous use, if it even can, and how to not only protect the land itself from the impact of a utility scale solar facility, but protect the county's interests too, financially, and what's going to be done with that land after the fact.
Thank you, Luke. So quickly, and I think it's important to touch on too on the policy side. You know, Luke went over most every topic that we try to work with communities to address, you know, and they're going to, I would say for the most part, most of the topics are consistent, but the outcomes, obviously, the policies are going to be specific to the community, and there's, you know, varying degrees of objectivity and subjectivity in the policies, and you know, whether those inform what's in the regulations as well in terms of things that the community wants to limit explicitly or allow for more flexibility on. And so there's some variability there, but I think the topics are pretty consistent between policy side and regulatory side. In terms of the value of a comprehensive plan policy in the permitting process, obviously, I think many of you are familiar with Section 15.2, 2232 of the Code of Virginia, but that relates to utilities and public utilities, which utility scale solar is considered. And localities can conduct what we call a 2232 review to determine whether or not a facility in its location, design, siting is in accordance with a community's comprehensive plan. So again, having a policy in place allows you, in a good, well thought out policy, does you a lot of utility in the review of a 2232 review application. We consider that review triggered by the use permit application, but we encourage communities to conduct that review separate, to conduct it initially, and allow for that review to complete before the commission starts to consider the use permit. It does relate to the siting agreement as well, and we would recommend that communities not begin entering negotiation for siting agreements, and other speakers will touch on this in more detail on the siting agreement side, but we recommend that they not start the siting agreement negotiation until the Planning Commission has conducted the 2232 review, and that the siting agreement be done in concert with the use permit. So the siting agreement public hearing and the use permit public hearing before the Board of Supervisors essentially occur simultaneously. So it's not in effect or perceived to be the case that the siting agreement negotiations and the outcomes there are informing the use permit action. Running out of time a little bit, so I just want to cover, we really strongly believe we want the use permit to focus on land use impacts directly related to the project, things that we can define as needing to be mitigated because of the project. Again, related to findings that are results of comp plan policies. There are mitigation actions that we think are better served by the siting agreement: monetary compensation tied to potential impacts, infrastructure needs, overarching community goals. Maybe they're related to the solar project. Maybe they're related to the aggregate of solar projects in a community rather than direct impacts of the project. There's some relationship. Conservation or ag, forested or wetland impacts, and you know, on a larger scale in the community, again, that you have policy support for. Unique conservation actions or other mitigation not directly tied to on-site land use impacts, and then revenue guarantees, financial side of the equation. So with that, I will turn it back to Eldon to introduce our next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Michael, and Luke. I'm going to hand it off now to Jeff Gore, who's going to talk a little. I love this, demystifying host siting agreements. Okay, Jeff, demystify for us.
Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
All right. Well, I'll do what I can, Eldon. I think a lot of communities haven't dealt with these yet, and some have started to. So, I think the backdrop from the folks at the Berkley Group was really helpful. Some of our clients, we're a law firm in Richmond. We work with localities. We do general counsel work around the state for regional entities and for localities in particular. And Berkley Group's done a great job working with some of our clients to update their policies because, it was said earlier that things have changed so rapidly in this area, both in the law and the technology, that understandably, most localities were sort of were behind. So that manifests in one way I see, and that is projects that were applied for and approved before some of these tools like siting agreements were enacted, have in some ways given the industry a bad name because localities really didn't have the tools to manage or mitigate those impacts of those projects and didn't really know what the impacts would be. It was new to everybody. And so I think you see projects out there that, probably weren't ideally sited, and certainly, buffers might not be adequate, setbacks, and other things as far as mitigation of impacts might not have been done. And so now you have projects coming through the pipeline where we do have tools to address those things. And I think it's very prudent of localities to revisit their comp plan, revisit their ordinance, and really start to think about, as a community, this industry is not going anywhere right now. We want to be prepared, right? So with that, I'm going to get into the site plan issue. This is a very unique authority that the General Assembly has granted in statute. It became law in 2020 with just solar facilities. In 2021, energy or battery storage facilities were added to this. And what you're doing here is the governing body negotiating a contract, right? It's Virginia doesn't have what they call contract zoning, but this really does tie into the zoning process. And this is an enforceable contract, and I'm going to get more into what that means. But the authority to negotiate terms under a siting agreement is extremely broad, to mitigate the impacts of the project, but also to provide benefits and terms and conditions that aren't even directly related to the project. And that's pretty unheard of in Virginia land use law. So we'll get a little bit more into that. And again, as you've already heard, the siting agreement is just part of this puzzle, right? It's one component that works in conjunction with your comp plan and other policies and your zoning ordinance and your conditional use permit or special exception permit process. Typically, that will all be part of this. So just some very high level definitions. They're pretty obvious. So the host locality, that's where the project is. Definitions of energy facilities, pretty much they are what they sound like they are. The only one that's a little bit more nuanced is the definition of solar facility. So what does this not apply to? I think the most important one to note is projects that are 5 megawatts or less. So the smaller projects that the code does not grant authority to do these for. Those other carve outs are not really what we're talking about anyway. Those have to do with net metering, have to do with a pilot program for user/generators of power up to 3 megawatts. So those are sort of unique circumstances. And so these carve outs don't really amount to much except for the 5 megawatt. So you got to be really aware that if it's a smaller project, this doesn't apply. Other tools apply. Obviously, your ordinance, special exception permit, comp plan, but not siting agreements. So just very briefly on the process. So in my experience, solar industry generally, they want to go through this process, right? They want to do what they can to increase the odds of favorable consideration. So that's probably why the statute is framed in a way that really envisions the applicant initiating this discussion, sending a letter to the locality saying, hey, we are going to, or we have already filed our permit or zoning application, but we also want to start negotiating a siting agreement. That sort of kicks it all off. And it's also significant that this is not a planning commission process, right? So every other land use, amendment, permit, anything that requires a public hearing, that's typically going to go through the planning commission first, right? But this statute specifically is just granting the authority to the governing body. And so it's kind of a parallel process, as Michael was saying earlier. And it's not the exact same process because you're just dealing with the governing body, while the planning commission might already be hearing the permit application or considering it. It does require a public hearing, and it can be done, like Michael said, at the same time as your permit. I think that makes sense to coordinate it. And again, I said it's a contract, so it's specifically in statute binding on not just it's on binding on all parties that sign it. So the applicant and their successors. So if these projects are sold, it's binding on whoever the projects are sold to, whoever ends up operating the facility, and it's binding on future governing bodies. So it's creating the contract. Tying it into the comp plan discussion, I think generally I do agree it makes sense to consider the land use factors in the traditional way, and that's through the planning commission. And part of their role is the 2232 substantial accord review. But you have the flexibility to not do it that way. If the governing body prefers to just handle that and do a substantial, because the siting agreement statute kind of overrides, in a sense, the 2232 planning commission process, and says that if the siting agreement is approved by the governing body, then therefore the 2232 is deemed approved. So that's something to think about as far as process. Now, I think what I bolded at the bottom there is one of the most important things to take away, and that is failure to reach an agreement can actually be used by the governing body as a reason to reject the land use applications. That's, I think, might be unprecedented in Virginia land use law. The statute says it can't be a sole reason. Locality can't say, hey, you didn't pay us $1 billion, which we thought was reasonable, so sorry, permit denied. I think if there are limits, governing bodies have to act reasonably. They can't act arbitrarily or capriciously in making land use decisions. So still bound by land use law, but I think this gives the locality quite a bit of leverage in those negotiations because, my knowledge, siting agreements, this hasn't been done to my knowledge, so it hasn't been litigated or tested in court. But how much more, what other reasons would you need to turn it down besides not reaching an agreement on the siting agreement? I don't know. The statute doesn't say. Are there some environmental concerns? Are there, is it just not suitable for the location because of the surrounding uses? What other reasonable concerns can you add on to and you wouldn't agree to terms with us in the siting agreement? So that just does give the locality a great deal of leverage in those discussions. So what can you include in a siting agreement? Again, it's very broad contractual authority. Provisions to mitigate any impact of the project. Most people think of the Romanet 2 there, financial compensation. Again, that's unique. Historically, in Virginia land use law, you could pretty much only do something like that through a negotiated proffer or a conditional rezoning, and that's even limited to certain situations. But this is a case where you're negotiating directly a contractual provision for payments that's enforceable. and that those financial contributions or payments simply have to be something that's in your CIP. So it's in your capital improvement plan, or it's in your current fiscal year budget, or if you have some sort of fund balance, perhaps you might have a capital fund reserve. You just have to have something in one of those buckets, right? So that is important. That's in the statute. So that is a requirement that the locality needs to think about if you have big projects that you think might be submitting applications. Dust off that CIP and consider whether you need to update that to include things that you would like to be able to fund, at least partially through revenue stream from a siting agreement. But very, very broad as far as what can be funded or subsidized through revenue payments through siting agreement. And then they threw in there, because it sounded good, I think, broadband. That's certainly something that we need more of, particularly in rural localities. And thankfully, with some federal money that's been pushed out recently, I think we're going to get there soon. But broadband specifically in the statute. So, all right, with that as a backdrop, what kind of terms and conditions have I seen typically in a siting agreement? Well, if you've done your homework and you've gone through the process to update your comp plan and your zoning ordinance and the provisions you require in your special exceptions or CUPs, then a lot of the things I have at the top are going to be covered, right? Things like setbacks, buffers, leaving existing vegetation, things like that to mitigate the environmental and visual impacts. Decommissioning, how do we return this thing? What's the burden of the project owner, the applicant, and their successors to return the land to its prior state? Bonds that need to be in place to cover the costs of that. Those bonds need to be updated. The value of the bonds need to be updated. So we'll typically get a 3 or a 5-year automatic review of the bond by a third-party engineer, and you get the bond amount updated, and they have to continue to keep that bond posted as security, kind of like a subdivision road bond or construction project performance bond. But that needs to be in place as protection for the locality and the community if things go south and the company walks and there's no one there to clean up. So that's very important. But that can be set out in your permit. It can be set out in your ordinance. Site access, this is I think more clarity on the locality's ability to access the property is better. So yes, under zoning law, under enforcement of zoning law, there are procedures and processes for accessing property that you think might have a violation going on, but I typically like more than that. I want explicit contractual authority regarding site access, because there's a lot of requirements. These are complicated projects as far as the land use impacts and mitigation requirements. A lot of things you've already heard. So site access, then things like during the construction, you get complaints about noise, truck traffic. Fencing, that's long-term. Things like that can be in the siting agreement to the extent you don't feel that your ordinances adequately address those. There's no limit on putting those in the siting agreement. Some things you more typically are going to see beyond those matters, obviously cash payments. A schedule. How is that? Are some of the payments, is it front loaded? Does it start small and escalate? Is there a provision for an inflationary factor? Things like that. Cash specifically for broadband. But here's where I would encourage planners and governing bodies and applicants to be creative. It doesn't have to be, there could be something that's more valuable to the community and would address community concerns more than just revenue, right? It could be mitigating some environmental concern, designating a resource protection area, wildlife corridors. I'm seeing more and more as a requirement. And that could be in your ordinance. It could be in your permit. But if it's not, and this particular project calls for that, you can negotiate it. Preservation of open space, dedication of land for public use. I've seen training of fire and rescue specifically to address with concerns with battery facilities and concerns of fire events there. So, there are more than a handful of these have now been approved. So you can go out there and find them and you can get examples, but they're all going to be different. They're all going to be tailored to the project and the community. And as the folks with Berkley Group said, they should really largely be underpinned by your policies and your comp plan and your zoning ordinance. This should be really dealing with things on top of that and focusing on, what else specifically does this project call for? Well, let me go back. I only have one more slide, so let me go back on the cash payment, because people might be wondering, what are we talking about here? What's in the realm of reasonable? Again, I think it depends on a lot of things: the scale and scope of the project, what other things are being provided in kind, land contributions or dedications. But just looking at some projects I've worked on and some others, I've seen a range from, for a 75 megawatt project I worked on, the payments were around 14 million over the life of the project. Again, there's a payment schedule of 30 to 40 years, depending on what's negotiated. I worked on another one that has a $17 million payment stream for a 106 megawatt project. And then there's one, if you go even bigger than that, there's a 300 megawatt project in Southside Virginia that I wasn't involved in, but it's over a 300 million all-in payment stream when you count taxes or the revenue share, which I'm not getting into today. But there are other sources of revenue. Either it's the local M&T tax, taxing the equipment, or revenue share ordinance, which would be adopted in lieu of your M&T tax. And it's a specific per megawatt assessment. So that's all part of the financial picture. But those equate to anywhere between 300,000 and 600,000 a year in payment stream for a project that doesn't lead to more school kids and doesn't generally require connection to public water utilities. It can be a net, very much a net positive as far as revenue for the locality. So again, just pulling back from the siting agreement, it's one part of it. It's just one piece of this puzzle. It's very important to have your zoning ordinance updated and you're starting with your comp plan, but then your zoning ordinance to enact the policy and vision that's in the comp plan, and then figuring out the 2232. This is going to be new to many planning commissions. And what does it mean? How does staff lead the planning commission through that? And then the special exception or conditional use permit, which is typically going to be required, because we're talking, usually these projects are on ag or industrial land that most zoning ordinances in rural localities where these big projects are going to require a permit on top of it. Again, that's a legislative act by your governing body, but it starts with the planning commission. And then I mentioned the revenue share versus machinery and tools. That's part of the financial picture. But all of this is tied together. It really is sort of a suite of tools and policies that all work together and hopefully allow the locality to sort of realize its vision for if these projects are going to be permitted, how they will be. Right? What kind of projects does the community support and make sense in that locality? And I do think we have more tools than ever to deal with this specific use than localities have had to deal with any land use ever. In my knowledge of 20 years of practicing local government law, anyway. So I think there's some significant opportunities that localities have to help shape how this land use develops in ways that can be very positive. In some cases for the right projects, but also these tools allow the locality to have a rational basis for denying the wrong project. So it's just a good opportunity to better deal with this new land use. Siting agreement obviously is a new creature of Virginia law, and it's something worth taking time to do for projects like this. So that's all I had, and get to questions.
Okay, we've got a few questions in the Q&A, and let's start with Don McGowan had asked, talk a little bit about, and this is really for Jeff, either you or Michael or Luke, or all of you, disadvantages as well as advantages of getting too specific in your comp plan. You obviously want to create a regulatory framework and start identifying a path forward for somebody coming with a proposal. But do you paint yourself in a corner if you get too specific?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it depends on what details of it, your policy you want to be specific about, which ones you want to be less specific about or not even address. I think you certainly want to give support for your regulations. So if you're going to allow the use, simply allow the use and that's it in your regulations, then I think you want to inform through the policy, the context of when and where and how that use is allowed. And then if you feel like your regulations deem to be more specific, then you may want to establish some baseline rationale for those certain levels of specificity in your regulations. I think it's just good practice to do that. We are planners. We do try to anticipate what outcomes are going to be through policy and through the implementation through regulations and permits. And there may be varying degrees about, in terms of how that's expected across communities, though.
Thank you, Michael. Jeff, anything?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Michael. I mean, obviously the comp plan is a guide. It's the vision. It's the policy. It's not strictly enforceable. I think what's unique in this use specifically is that this process is tied to the siting agreement, and it points to the comp plan and the 2232 process. So it's almost like in this area, the General Assembly has said that solar projects have a heightened sort of presence in the comp plan, and the comp plan has a heightened presence in the land use decision. So I think it makes sense to go beyond simply saying, our goal is to preserve prime farmland and the bucolic viewshed. All right, well, what does that mean with regard to this use? And I think having some, not necessarily detail, but a little more meat on the bones in your comp plan in this area and for this use is advisable, because it really, even the land use decisions are going to go back more specifically to the comp plan than with other uses. So I think it's important to bear that in mind and beef up your comp plan if you can, but not be too specific, because again, you don't want to tie your hands, and it's not an ordinance. It's not strictly enforceable.
Well, as I like to repeat from the words of Mike Chandler, a comprehensive plan is not self-implementing. All right, different topic. In forested areas, what is a reasonable limitation on the amount of clearing percentage-wise of tree cover that should be permitted?
Yeah, I think it's going to be community specific. I mean, we would never suggest that there's a baseline percentage. I will say though, obviously, and many of you probably are familiar with HB 206, which does essentially say that Clearing of 50 acres or more of contiguous forest land is considered a significant adverse impact, and we may see something come out. We should be seeing something coming out of HB 206 in terms of what I anticipate maybe is what type of mitigation options would be available for those impacts. But beyond that, it's going to vary. I mean, we've worked with communities that have said, we have no old growth forest. All of our forested areas have been timbered. It's all replanted pine. There's no value to it. So we have no policy that limits tree removal. Whereas we've had other localities that have said, we have old growth forests, we have ecological cores, we have wildlife networks, and we want to establish some policy that preserves those areas as best we can. I think the approach I've liked to take, where there are areas where communities have, and in a lot of cases, communities have already identified, they've done planning through other planning projects that have identified the value of forested areas. And that's great, because I think it's not as simple as saying, for solar, we're going to limit the removal of forested areas and acreage that's forested. Well, again, you have to, what's the rationale for that limit? You know, to the community, what's the value of the forested area? And then, you know, once you start to investigate that and define that, then perhaps you can derive at some acceptable limit of impact and scales. You know, maybe below X amount of acres is okay. You know, above that amount, there's expected to be some mitigative action, and above this amount, perhaps that's, you know, that should be precluded in terms of a policy statement, and then you can evaluate that through individual permits.
You also have to think about how you're going to keep the landowner from just timbering their land anyways, if that's the tack you want to take.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we've also seen localities tackle with defining project size relative to development size. And there's something to be said for recognizing that you may have areas that are undeveloped within a project that could be preserved for some time, that may not otherwise be preserved because they were not included within a project. So there are certain benefits from solar projects related to preservation of natural resources. Certainly there's impacts as well, but I think you have to consider those on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, we've got more questions, but we're getting tight on time. I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to hold the others maybe for being able when we do our next Q&A. And HB 1183 from the 2021 session called for a study and report of battery storage. Has there been any outcome from that that any of the panel members are familiar with?
I'm not, Jeff. I don't know if you are.
No, I've not heard of any results from that, Eldon.
Okay.
Yeah, I would only just add we've worked on best practices, and I think there are some other speakers that will touch on that.
Okay. All right. For the sake of time, I'm going to move us to our next section on emerging topics. I still think we're going to have a little time to come back to Nancy's second question and Luke's, I mean, not Luke, but Nick Rogers' comments on placemaking, and we'll try to hit those a little later. Okay, emerging topics, mitigation regulations, HB 206, as has already been mentioned. Kyle Shreve is here with Advantus Strategies. Kyle, take it away.
Thanks, Eldon, and I want to thank the Alliance for the Shenandoah for having me. I'm Kyle Shreve. I'm with Advantus Strategies now, but I had, prior to my starting here, I was the executive director of the Virginia Agribusiness Council for the last 5 years, and so I was there when House Bill 206 was initially negotiated and passed into law. Now in my representation of Advantus, we represent the Virginia Forestry Association and have been involved on that side of things, but we also represent the Rural Solar Development Coalition, representing a number of localities that have band together to try to talk about and deal with solar applications in their localities. So come at this from a lot of different angles. I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as I can, 10 minutes or so, and then hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions you may have moving forward. Let's see if I can get this to advance. There we go. So for those who don't know what House Bill 206 was, Delegate Mike Weber from Fauquier County introduced this in 2022, passed the General Assembly and became law. And it requires mitigation for loss of prime agricultural soils and forest land in a solar project development. 10 acres of prime agricultural soils, and I want to let everybody know it's not farm land. It is the actual soil that was used. And USDA has a definition of prime agricultural soils, class 1 and class 2, as the resource that was trying to be preserved. I'll go into a little bit more about what that means here in a minute. As was said, 50 acres of forest land disturbed was a significant impact. And then disturbance of any land enrolled in forest land use taxation program. There's a number of counties that have adopted ordinances and participate in the state program for forest land, and any land disturbed there is automatically included. So the bill required DEQ to convene a stakeholder work group to start the regulatory process. And the work group that was convened in 2022 had 84 work group participants. It was what Senator Chap Peterson, the Senate Agriculture Committee chairman at the time, called the mother of all work groups. And it's certainly the biggest one I've ever been involved in. It contained ag and forestry organizations from all over the Commonwealth, both statewide and regional. It included environmental organizations that participate in the process all the way down the line, a number of different solar developers, as you can imagine, as well as local government representatives, individual local government representatives, and VACO and VML. So it really was a very, very long. We divided up into subgroups to discuss a number of different topics, which I'll get into. And as you can imagine, it was contentious. And as also you can imagine, there was very little consensus reached on any of the groups. And it's going to be up to DEQ to sort that out. Starting in 2023, the department cobbled together a regulatory advisory panel, which was much smaller. It's still meeting. I've continued to participate in those discussions, but it's more along the lines of about 20 people, 20 to 25. And then subject matter experts are called in from places like Virginia Cooperative Extension, the Department of Forestry, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, all the way down the line if there are any specific answers that the work group needed or topics that needed to discuss. The bill itself said that final regulations needed to be adopted by December 31st, 2024. So we are expecting draft regulations to be drafted and actually put out early next year in the spring so that DEQ can go through the regulatory process and get those done by the deadline of what the bill specified. Two things I want to emphasize, though, as we get into the substance of the bill here in the next few minutes, is that because of those deadlines and what we've talked about, DEQ has put out a number of proposals, none of which are final. So take everything I say and you could throw them out the window. There's a possibility you could throw them out the window next year. What I'm going to report on is just what has been discussed and what mitigation means and could look like, but nothing is final. So if something happens, I don't want you coming back next year and saying, Kyle, what you told us was wrong. It will have been because DEQ will have changed its mind or tweaked it during the formal regulatory process. All solar applications to PGM that has been submitted and accepted by the interconnection agency before December 31st, 2024 are exempt, and the bill says they are exempt from mitigation regulations because they didn't want to pull the rug out from under everybody that had already had an application in or a installation going in that was already way down the line. That was going to be pretty costly, and it would have caused a lot of renegotiations, re-permit, and the General Assembly said that that wasn't fair during the bill process. So any application that has gone on at a time, this will just be for those projects that come after the January 1, 2025 and beyond, once the regulations are adopted. The key issues going on in 2026 is a loss of resources and what you are losing on there, as well as the impact of the solar. Now, we mentioned before, DEQ has just updated its stormwater regulations for runoff. One of the things that was brought up extensively during the committee meetings is the Chesapeake Bay program treats solar panels as unconnected impervious surfaces. And so during the discussions, it was brought up that we needed to try to mitigate that from a water quality standpoint. Now, I want to make clear that that's what the Chesapeake Bay program says. I know there's been an awful lot of discussion and contention around whether or not solar should be treated as impervious surface. It's not neither here nor there. It's what the Bay program treats it as when they do their calculations for the model. And so that's why we are using this to try to mitigate the impacts on the Bay as well as one of the considerations. The big questions for agricultural soil mitigation was compaction and soil loss. Again, those stormwater impacts with regards to that. And that includes things like planting grass, proper vegetation underneath, after installation, the value of the land itself, right? So what does mitigation look like? What are we talking about when we say the value of the loss of agricultural land, economic value to the farmer if it's part of your comprehensive plan? What is the conservation value of or not of ag land? And what are the ecosystem service benefits of land? And how is that mitigated, right? So on-site mitigation can be things like planting vegetation, pollinator habitat, continuing to use it for agriculture underneath even after it's done, or preserving ag land elsewhere, which has been discussed regularly during the meeting. What does mitigation look like when it comes to on-site mitigation versus off-site mitigation? And that includes in lieu mitigation. Does somebody make a payment to a conservation fund, foundation, a state program, and does that count, and how much? Those are all things that DEQ are going to have to sort out. As you can imagine, the ag and forestry groups have a much different opinion of what that should look like than the solar developers, much different opinion than localities, all things that have been discussed at length during the work group meetings. The other big question around agricultural is mapping those soils. And the other reason we used USDA's definition and linked it to soil is because USDA has a very extensive mapping system that they have to map the soils. And so it was thought that would be much easier to comply with, or at least give solar developers an idea of where those soils are if they want to try to either calculate their costs or look elsewhere for when it comes to siting. So that's what it is. There is going to have to be some ground truthing. They're going to have to do some soil sampling and testing, which most do anyway, was what was reported, but that they would do that and then submit the results to DEQ as to whether mitigation was required or not. Issues with forest land. Is the land still forested or not, or has it been harvested in the last 2 years prior? Something was brought up. So proper forest practices require the land to be harvested every so often. It's about 30 years for pine, 70 to 80 years when it comes to hardwood as part of proper forest management. And so, it was brought up that as long as that land is not converted to another type of use, whether industrial or development, then it should be counted as forest land as a part of a regular harvesting activity when it comes to forest health, all done in conjunction with the Department of Forestry. So what is the value of the land itself, the economic value of the timber that you are losing, whether it be for sawmill or pulp and paper, conservation value of that, ecosystem service benefits of that, carbon sequestration, all the way down the line. And what are those offsets? All things they have to do. One other thing is we have what's called in Virginia forest cores, which is typically about 100 acres or more of forest land that remain intact. And so DEQ is playing around with the idea of giving those a higher mitigation ratio and value factor if you are disturbing one of those forest cores to try to keep them intact. And again, one-for-one easement. Does mitigation have to be a one-for-one easement? On-site mitigation is very hard to do in forest land. You cut down the trees, you don't replant them. Very difficult to get trees to grow there. You can mess around with, but there's some buffers that can be done. But for the most part, preservation of forest land elsewhere is what's being discussed. Or again, in lieu mitigation, do you send a fee into a fund that accomplishes that mission elsewhere? The local issues that we were talking about is DEQ notification and local notification of an NOI as soon as possible. It's become pretty clear that sometimes during the process, as a developer is developing a project, they get their cut from the locality, but then the locality loses sight of where they are in the rest of their permitting. And so DEQ is trying to increase coordination with the locality about where they are, what's in the NOI as soon as possible. Siting agreements may allow for mitigation, as Jeff mentioned. And so something to keep in mind in the locality and siting agreement is DEQ will likely recognize those mitigation efforts as a part of their process after their application is submitted, if it meets the DEQ specifications for mitigation. So something to think about. That's likely, again, not final, but likely to be included. And then again, where does the mitigation have to occur? Is it in the same watershed? Is it in the same HUC? Is it in the same, right now, DEQ's proposal is to base it on watersheds. Again, if you negotiate mitigation in a siting agreement, you're keeping it closer to home of where the actual mitigation occurs. So with that, again, I covered a lot of stuff in a very short amount of time. There may be questions, but I want to make sure I leave it to thanks and my emails on the screen now. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. Appreciate that. Yes, a lot of information in a short period of time, and 206 is a monster.
It is a very big process. Yes, absolutely. And we're not done yet.
No. And I'm now going to switch us over to Julie Bolthouse with the PEC to talk about a small emerging topic of data centers and transmission infrastructure. Julie.
Yes, very tiny little thing. As we're transitioning over to renewables, one of the emerging topics that's really blown up is data center energy demand. And it's because it's moving the goalpost on us and really hindering our state's ability to make progress on, Virginia Clean Economy Act and our goals in terms of meeting climate change needs. So anyways, my name is Julie Bolthouse. I'm the Director of Land Use with Piedmont Environmental Council. We're a locally based donor-supported 501c3 organization. We're an accredited land trust. We strive to make Virginia a leader in conservation, restoration, smart growth, and climate action. Our core approach to doing that is educating, engaging, and empowering people to affect positive change in their communities. And our mission is to protect and restore the lands and waters of the Virginia Piedmont while building stronger and more sustainable communities. We cover a 9-county region, which spans Clark County and Loudoun County down to Charlottesville in the south. We're on the other side of the mountain from the Shenandoah Valley Alliance. And I appreciate them giving me the opportunity to join in this webinar. So our presentation today is going to cover data centers, increasing demand, new transmission lines, and new energy infrastructure investments, including battery storage. I'm going to go very fast, and there's a lot more to all of this, but I've only got 10 minutes, so I encourage you to check out our website, which Eldon mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. So first thing I want to start with is, what is a data center? A data center is a facility that stores and shares applications and data. Most of what we're seeing is hyperscale facilities like this new one, this one right here with aisles and aisles of server racks. To ensure redundancy, they very often have generators, as you can see on one side of the building there, and that's accompanied often by fuel storage, which you can see on the other side of the building. Data centers use a lot of electricity 24/7. And in fact, most of the proposals that we've seen oftentimes include their own substation and transmission lines delivering bulk energy to the site. For context, data center buildings use between 30 to 90 megawatts on average. According to Dominion, at peak usage, 1 megawatt serves 250 homes. That means that a single data center building uses more electricity than most small towns. That power also has to come from somewhere, though, and our grid doesn't currently have it. And that means a lot of new generation sources need to come online. So for perspective, Northern Virginia, specifically Loudoun, boasts the largest data center market in the world. This graph right here just shows in comparison to the other 16 largest data center markets where Northern Virginia is. And as you can see, we're far and beyond the largest. But let's step back for a minute and look at what trends are driving this. The digital age is the electrification of the 21st century. And what we're seeing today is a result of data, being readily available at the touch of a button, but not really being processed and stored within our devices. Increasingly, that process and storage is taking place in a data center. Your phone, for example, would absolutely not have the capability of running something like an AI chat GBT software program without the help of data centers. And this is just a list of some of the things. It's not all of them, but outsourcing of information, advancing smartphone technology, rollout of rural broadband, storage and processing of data, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, all of that. So this is a map of our regional transmission organization, PJM, which coordinates and directs the local utilities. Earlier this year, PJM put out its 2023 forecast showing what load growth looks like for the region. They predict a 1% annual decline in peak summer load for PJM in their Western territory. They predict a 0.3 annual decline in peak summer load projection for their Mid-Atlantic territory. And here is Dominion. This is a 5% increase in the peak summer load and is attributed to the projections from data center demand increases. As you can see, the load growth in Dominion territory is astounding. This is an additional 23 gigawatts by 2038. That's a doubling of the peak load within 14 years. That's double the city of New York, for example, which has 11.5 gigawatts. This is why we're going to continue to see energy infrastructure take center stage here in Virginia. And we're going to have to plan to build enough. Well, we're pushing back on, should we actually be making this demand come to life? But we're going to be having to build out enough electrical infrastructure to potentially serve 2 cities of New York if we continue with this trend and we continue to do this. So data centers are the primary driver of this load growth. I want to point out this slide because it demonstrates that this is not coming from residential. You can see residential is actually declining or is stable, and it's not coming from other industrial uses. This robust commercial load growth is driven by data centers, as the slide shows from Dominion. Earlier this year, Dominion released its integrated resource plan, which presented 5 options for addressing this massive increase in demand. The black line is the minimum PJM reliability requirement, and this graph is showing option B, but all the options include delayed retirements of fossil fuel sources, heavy reliance on purchasing out-of-state power, billions for new transmission lines to move that power, and new fracked gas power generation, small modular nuclear, which is not really well proven at scale and is very costly. We're also starting to see some of those things move forward. In response to growing power demand, PJM requested proposals for new transmission lines and upgrades to existing lines to address the data center load growth in Northern Virginia for the next 5 years. So this is only addressing the next 5 years. The red lines are new greenfield lines, new 500 kV lines, and the black is parallel to existing lines but requires new right-of-way, and purple is wreck and rebuild within existing right-of-way. BZ put this map together to show the 72 proposals on one map. Not all of them are going to be selected, but some of them will, and this gives us a better way of looking at, what they actually look like, because PJM's maps honestly are junk, and that actually led to many inaccuracies on our map, but very frustrating process. The final selections will be made in December of this year, and if data center demand continues to rise, we will see more of these. You may have also read that Dominion has recently revived its plan to build a natural gas peaker plant in Chesterfield. This would be the largest natural gas facility in Virginia at 1 gigawatt and will have terrible impacts on the community and the environment, and also is located in an area where it will disproportionately affect low-income and vulnerable residents. So also another trend that we're seeing is for more battery storage deployment on the grid, which is an important part of a renewable grid. And Dominion has made some investments in this. As you can see, we've got 3 lithium-ion storage facilities in Powhatan, New Kent, and Hanover counties, and 2 large ones that are permitted and starting to move forward in Chesterfield and Dulles Airport. However, lithium batteries can have, first of all, they only provide short-term backup, and they can pose some risk in terms of thermal runaway fires and environmental hazards from the toxic metals in the batteries that can leach into waterways. So we're actually kind of excited to see that Dominion is also looking at long duration energy storage pilot projects. They've got 2, well, it's at one site in Henrico County, but 2 different processes that they're looking at that site: iron air batteries and zinc hybrid batteries, which hopefully can deal with some of those concerns with the lithium storage facilities. And then finally, I just want to highlight a few other investments in energy infrastructure that are happening, just to keep your eye on and be aware of. The National Interest Electric Transmission Corridor designation. This is something that's moving forward for applicant-driven transmission lines, and it would unlock federal investment and regulatory permitting and controls. Although it could be positive in terms of connecting some renewable energy, it also could have devastating impacts in terms of localities' ability to have any input on the siting and routing of transmission lines, especially knowing that many of these transmission lines are actually just going to data centers. And then smart grid enhancements. There's a lot of federal investments going into that. Dominion just got $33 million. Continued need and support for solar, both utility scale solar, and we're hoping to see more for small scale distributed solar, and then small modular nuclear. There's pilot projects being discussed down in Wise County area, well, Southwest Virginia. I think there's multiple areas they're looking at. And then there's a clean hydrogen investment, $7 billion across the country. One of the hubs is near us, the Appalachian Hydrogen Hub, which will span from West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. A lot I could say about that, but I'm not going to go into that depth because we don't have time. And federal investments in domestic manufacturing and research and development. Some of these are really exciting, like solar recycling. That's going to be something we're going to need, and I think there's going to be some opportunities for that nearby. And then transformer manufacturing and semiconductors and batteries. With that, I'll turn it back over to Eldon for questions.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Thank you very much. One question for you that has come up is the pictures that you showed of those very large data centers, is that the prevailing type still being built, or is there going to be a trend to a smaller data center? The questioner, Nancy, said she'd seen some recent publications saying that the small edge data centers may be the future trend.
If it is, I have not seen it in actuality. I have heard about a lot. There's a lot of talk about edge data centers, but when you look at all the applications on the ground, they're all massive hyperscale data centers as far as I've seen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. What I'm going to do right now in some of our remaining minutes is drop back to some of our questions that really is to the broader group. And we had a couple questioners asking about the fact that it seems like the solar development is all greenfield. Is there any trend or interest, and if not, why not, in pushing solar development to the existing built environment? And I'm going to ask our planners and maybe our lawyer, have you seen any negotiations there in any of proposals coming forward?
I mean, I think from my perspective, the reason why we're seeing projects in the locations that they are is finance, the financial component of it. I mean, it's cheaper land than it is to locate on, in some cases, brownfields or industrial sites or, in urban environments. I mean, certainly I would hope that we would see opportunities for urban installations, especially, over parking lots on buildings, but buildings have to be designed to accommodate them initially. So, retrofits are not always an option. And it's just the land is more costly. For me, it boils down to, I mean, you have a mandate on the state's two largest utility companies, and they're going to look to, and they're responsive to the ratepayers. So they have to do it in a financially viable way. So,
but a locality could say in their comp plan update process, hey, we have an interest and maybe would give preference to that type of development.
Absolutely.
Nothing preventing a locality from doing that.
Yeah, and absolutely they should. And they should make sure that their regulations allow for it and not preclude it. But more often than not, and we've seen this, we've seen localities in their comp plan say we have a preference for brownfields, we have a preference for industrial land, but more often than not, it's going to go on greenfield sites. And it just boils down to the economics of it.
But
a lot of localities also offer property tax discounts for solar on the built environment. I know Fairfax and Loudoun, I think, has that, where you can take off the solar in terms of your property taxes.
I'll jump in here, Eldon. We hear that question all the time from community members in the Shenandoah Valley. Like, why aren't we seeing more solar on brownfields, parking lots, closed landfills? We are hearing that in the new Federal Inflation Reduction Act, there are some incentives to make those projects pencil out better. So we're hopeful as those programs roll out, we'll start to see more of the projects that people really support.
Yeah, I think real quickly on this, I agree with all that. This speaks to the larger issue of this location generally, right? How does the industry pick their sites? And in my experience representing localities is that the company, the development company typically, has already picked their sites and already negotiated with landowners or started those negotiations before they start talking to the locality, right? So I feel like, and that's the business model, and that's, I think, it's financial and it's economics. I get that, but at the same time, I think it has led in many cases to they just don't have all the knowledge as to the political process or all the knowledge as to what other land might be viable In other words, if there were an ideal brownfield site in a locality that the industry hadn't identified and had already, but if they had come to the locality first and the locality said, yeah, we've got this inventory of areas that we think are pretty ideal. They're close to transmission lines. They're high voltage lines. They're close to, they're not surrounded by other non-compatible uses. There can be examples where that conversation could be productive. And the locality could say, well, we know that if we approve a site there, we're going to get so much less pushback from the community that we would be willing to not negotiate as hard in the siting agreement process. So, in exchange for less revenue from this project, we'd be willing to site it over here. But those conversations, in my experience, don't happen because the development company, the solar company, has already picked its site and they're kind of locked in. And then it's a matter of, take it from there. Then they uncover all the problems with that site, and which can make it a bumpy road on the land use side.
And there, Jeff, is where you might want to paint yourself a little farther into the corner in your comp plan, so that the 2232 review process, you say, yeah, that's not what we're saying is right for our community. So, okay, we are getting tight on time. I'm going to ask a question of our hosts. Do y'all have a mechanism where clearly we're not going to get to all these questions that have been popping in, where we can do some follow-up after the webinar?
Definitely. We can post these on our website and send out the link to the folks that were registered. Okay.
All right. Very, very good. Let's see. I'm going to pick one more question. And Jeff, I think this one probably is best for you. Is there local authority for real estate tax reductions allowed as part of the siting agreements?
Yeah, I heard Julie mention that. I was hoping I wouldn't be asked that, Eldon.
So somebody else actually asked it in the Q&A before Julie brought it.
Yeah, real property taxes, that's driven by the state constitution, and which requires as a baseline that all real estate be valued at fair market value unless there is a statute that deviates from that or allows a locality to deviate from that. And I could be wrong. I'm not aware of a statute that authorizes localities to discount the fair market value rate of property that's under solar panels. So if someone has that statute, I'd appreciate it. I'm not aware of it. Now, that being said, there are other ways to get at that, right? So if it's seen as an economic development project, the county does have tools working with its economic development authority or industrial development authority to create some sort of grant program, and that's very common in the economic development setting, as you know, Eldon, where the locality governing body appropriates funds to its EDA, who in turn has the authority that the county doesn't have or the locality doesn't have to provide basically subsidized tax payments of an industry, of a business. So there's ways to get at that. I'm not aware of the direct route in the property.
And Jeff and as we all know, I'm not an attorney. I try to listen to a lot of them, and I agree with Jeff. I don't think there is direct authority to be able to do that. But Jeff identifies it is a separate transaction that is handled by the IDA/EDA, and you can time limit that. Say, okay, we're going to give you help the first 3 years or what have you. Julie, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Loudoun County, I just pulled up their webpage on it. They have what they call their certified solar energy equipment exemption. And they say that the Virginia General Assembly enacted legislation declaring certified solar equipment facilities and devices and certified.
That's different. That's different than real property. That's
okay.
That's more in the personal property.
That's the equipment. Okay. That's the personal property.
That might be what the confusion is then.
Yeah, okay, gotcha. That's one of the most confusing statutes in the Virginia Code. You need a big whiteboard to chart out exactly how it applies. But there are exemptions, and 4 different sizes of projects and when the project came online, and it's extremely confusing. But just on this issue, it's the State Corporation Commission that values this equipment. And so they have depreciation schedules they update from time to time. But so you've got the SEC that does the value. You've got the state code that provides a discount depending on the project and the size of it and the timing of it. So there's a different, you got to work with your commissioner of revenue or finance department director when you're analyzing the issue of taxes. It's complicated. But, you know, a real property discount, that would have to be in the Constitution, I think, to authorize that.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm sorry that we dumped the question you didn't want to have to answer on you, but we appreciate you taking it on because it's a thorny issue. I'll add one thing from that local revenue standpoint. The commissioners of revenue are working hard on this, and they have created different levels of presentations that they've been giving, and a commercial for APA Virginia. We're working with the commissioners, and one of our webinar series coming up will be the commissioners talking about the whole complex mishmash of revenue. You heard Jeff talk about there's the revenue sharing, there's a machinery and tools tax, but then you've got real estate tax, and the General Assembly changed the law almost annually over a period of about 4 or 5 years. And I go back to the Rappahannock River Basin Commission. One of the recommendations to its legislative members was stop, let the dust settle, give us all time to understand this very complex system. If a project was approved in a particular year, it had a certain authority. If it was approved the next year, it had different authority. And then the siting agreement came into effect in 2020. So that revenue side has been a moving target. And like I say, like Jeff mentioned, refer to your commissioner of revenue. They're working hard to understand it and educate their membership on the complexities. With that, Kate, I think we're just about out of time. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Sadly just about out of time. There are a bunch of great questions right now in the Q&A. I want to know the answer to a lot of them. So we will try to track down answers and post those up on this website. I want to give a big thanks to our speakers today. There's a lot of expertise on this call right now, and a shout out to Sarah Holberg. She's the one who recruited these knowledgeable people to come and talk with us today. The contact information for these speakers, email addresses, and phone numbers is posted on this webpage with the agenda. So you'll be able to contact them directly. And that's also where we'll post the recording of this. This has been recorded, so we'll post that. And then any follow-up answers that we can get to the questions. A big thanks to our partners, Piedmont Environmental Council, the 3 planning district commissions, and Virginia Environmental Endowment for making this possible. It's great to see you all. Thanks for being here. Have a good rest of your day.